Well, good evening to everybody out there who is watching in on this Facebook live session. You're very welcome indeed. I'm sure there'll be lots of people joining during the evening. We're taking this opportunity while we're in this strange situation of not being able to do these old-fashioned town hall meetings, of having in effect a Facebook town hall meeting. So this is open to the public. It's been widely promoted and advertised. And we're delighted that Jeremy Miles, MS, one of our leading lights in the Assembly and one of our most significant ministers in the Assembly, is able to join us here tonight. Good evening to you, Jeremy.
Hi, Huw. How are you?
Keeping very well indeed. Are you down in Neath this evening?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for the invitation of joining the discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
No, well, it's great to have you. I'm just going to explain, first of all, Jeremy, some of the way it works. This is sort of new to me, but I know you've done a couple of these yourself, including in the constituency. But for those who are joining us tonight, this is roughly how it works. Everybody's watching in. Jeremy and I are not watching the Facebook screen. It's like Jeremy and I are in a room where you can throw questions at us, throw comments and so on. We've had quite a few questions already submitted, which is great. And believe you me, they cover everything under the sun. But you can add to them as the night goes on as well. So if you're watching this on Facebook, there should be some facility there on the Facebook Live where you can put reactions, comments, questions. One of my assistants then is watching that because I'm not in the same room, if you like, and they will ping to me some of the most interesting questions there. Look, we're not going to be able to get through them all, quite frankly. And in fact, in advance, we've had scores of questions submitted as well. But we'll try and do as much as we can in getting through it. Now, we've already had questions, Jeremy, on really big ticket issues like constitutional matters, future of Wales, future of the UK, relationships. We've had lots of questions, obviously, on COVID, the response in Wales across the UK, both up to now, but also going forward. We've had a lot of questions on something that's very close to you because you've got responsibility for it, which is the post-COVID recovery. And this buzzword, which I'm not sure if you use, to be honest, of building back better and what that means for Wales and so on. So it's going to be a really interesting evening, and we're going to try and get through as much as we can. And if there's questions left over, then, you know, I'll pick them up afterwards and try and answer them, especially if you're my own constituents. So get involved, keep it interactive, and let's make a start. Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you first because I know you well. But it'd be really good if you can explain your responsibilities within Welsh Government as well as your constituency, because it's really quite wide-ranging what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Huw, firstly, and thank you, as I say, for the invitation. It's I'm really looking forward to this evening. So, as you say, I'm the member of the Senedd for Neath. I was elected in 2016. We both were, and I live in the Swansea Valley. But I'm my government responsibilities, I'm Counsel General, which means I'm the Welsh Government's law officer, just like the Attorney General in Parliament. But I'm also Minister for European Transition, which is about ensuring our planning for the end of the transition period as we come out of the European Union and all the negotiations with the UK government around that. I've spent most of my afternoon doing that on Zoom today. And then as of a few months ago, as the COVID crisis hit us, the First Minister asked me to take on, as well as that, the responsibility for coordinating the long-term response to COVID in Wales. So what that basically means is getting a common understanding right across the government of the impact that COVID is having on Wales in all its aspects, economic, environmental, health, you know, all those factors, having a common understanding across the government so we can then prioritise how we respond to it. And you were saying earlier, this idea of building back better. I actually, as you were saying, I don't actually use that term. I prefer to use the word reconstruction because I think that tells you a bit more about it. It isn't a question of going back to what we had before. It's a question of trying to solve some of those challenges that have become even more urgent as a consequence of COVID. And actually, the other thing is it's important to see both the kind of consequences of Brexit and COVID together because they will be affecting us at the same time. So that really is a quick run through what I spend my day doing in the government.
Okay, that's brilliant. In which case you'll either be glad or terrified to know that we've already got questions pretty much on everything you've mentioned.
Okay.
So here we go. Let's get into this. Let's get underway. Some people out there will welcome what we're going to start with. Other people will find it the most boring thing in the world. But it's the thing that's been hitting the headlines this week. It's the big constitutional issues, Jeremy. Wales, UK relationships. You've been very outspoken this week, and this has been picked up by some of our questioners in terms of some of the areas that you've described as an absolute clawback in terms of where we are with devolution. So Gareth is going to lead us off with the first questions. He noted that you've been really outspoken in recent days on the clawback on devolved powers, what you've described yourself as a power grab. In fact, I think you've been more outspoken than that. Gareth also notes that our finance secretary in the Senedd, the Trefnydd, has been equally outspoken on the failure of the UK government to work constructively with the Welsh government on the issue of tax devolution, which has been going on for months and months and months with no breakthrough. So he asks, are we now heading to a crunch moment for the UK and Wales relationship, not least with Boris Johnson's government?
Well, look, I mean, what you've seen this week has been quite outrageous, and I absolutely make no apologies, Huw, for the way that I've been describing it, because we all need to be really aware of what's going on. Really, I would say for the first time since devolution, the UK government has gone out of its way to try and claim back powers for itself, which are currently in devolved areas. So there's a big constitutional argument, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, but there's a practical daily implication of this as well. You know, in Wales, we've always been able to set our own standards in things like animal welfare, food standards, single-use plastics, environmental regulation. All those areas are devolved. And what this bill this week means is that it will be possible in the future to sell goods in Welsh supermarkets which do not comply with those standards. And we will not be able to prevent that. Provided they comply with standards in some other part of the UK, we won't be able to stop that. On top of that, the government in London is actually taking back extra powers and claiming for itself powers to run things which the Welsh government currently run. So this is a very serious attack, I would say, on the devolved settlement. And we've got to respond to that. I think Gareth is right. You know, there is a crunch point. I would say I've been in this job for 2 years, I think, more or less. And I think, you know, even under Theresa May, things weren't as bad as they are under Boris Johnson, really. I think there is a deliberate, flagrant, really, disregard of the constitutional rights of people in Wales, you know. And I think we've got to recognise that the system that we have now doesn't work for us. I know that you and I see eye to eye on this here in terms of the changes that we need to see. We need to have better protections for Welsh democracy, for what people in Wales are voting for, because this bill is an example of what will happen if we don't have those reforms in our constitution. And I know you and I again share this view. Constitutional arguments end up affecting people in their daily lives. You know, it's about democracy in Wales. People have voted for a Welsh Labour government. They voted for a particular way of running Welsh public life, and that will be undermined. Their choice will be undermined if we let this go unchallenged.
Okay, well, look, thanks for that. I noticed in the Facebook live comments, Andrew from Gilfach, who I know, he's picked up on this issue of, well, how robust should we be? Should we be pushing for even more powers to be devolved? Should we be, in a sense, being quite muscular about this and demanding more rather than let the UK government say we're going to take stuff away from you? But look, before you answer that, we've had a couple of people submit comments about this, about whether this is the time. Obviously, you've seen the stuff in the public domain about Welsh independence and so on.
Yeah.
But we've also had people asking about whether this is the time to actually move to a more federal system something where there is a greater balance of parity between the governmental institutions, and not just in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, but the big city regions like Manchester, Birmingham, London. You know, they have powerful mayors, and they have, in some ways in London, they have power over policing. They have more powers than we do. So, you know, is there some coalition of those who can actually say to the UK government, hold on now, this is going too far?
Absolutely there is, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There's a debate in Wales about independence. My own view is that this is a question of reform right across the UK. You've got a government here which is challenging all sorts of democratic rules. We saw them in the Supreme Court last year. They've launched a new commission which is trying to roll back other rights and so on that we take for granted. So this is an issue right across the UK, and I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be a fundamental set of reforms of how the UK works. It's the most centralised economy. It's the most centralised democracy in Europe, really, and that again has an impact in the daily lives of people in Wales. You know, so we have got to build, as you say, a coalition of support in other parts of the UK for reform. We work actually closely with the Scottish Government, the Northern Irish Government, and we've been doing a lot more work recently, as you say, with some of the metro mayors, you know, in Liverpool and in Manchester and so on, because there are a number of common issues that we can work together. And I think we've got to, you know, in the 80s, there was Charter 88, wasn't there, which was about a fundamental set of reforms. And I think we've got to have that sort of campaign again, where we look completely afresh at the Constitution of the UK and protect people's rights.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, look, we're going to move on, because otherwise we're going to be in danger of boring people who think the Constitution is just, you know, two bald men arguing over a comb. But it is important, but we're going to move on. But it actually links into something that Harry has submitted a question on, but it's to do with the COVID response. Now, Harry, it does have a link, curiously, to our previous discussion. Harry looks at the way in which governments across the UK have responded to coronavirus. Very often, as Mark Drakeford has said, we've been on the same hymn sheet, but it's undoubtedly the case that there has been, it's been commented on, the perception is a slightly more cautious approach within Wales in some areas, not wanting to rush it, putting an emphasis on it. Now, Harry's question is, how and why is the coronavirus response differed across the 4 UK nations? And is this going to affect the way that the 4 nations work together after the pandemic?
Well, you know, I think firstly, what we've said as a government in Wales is we want to take a 4 nations approach, really, where we work hand in hand with other governments across the UK, because on a public health crisis like we've been facing, that's obviously the best way to work, isn't it? Now, what a 4 nations approach doesn't mean doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. It probably means doing, you know, broadly the same thing in the same circumstances, if you like. So, you know, I do think the general direction of travel across the UK has been broadly the same, but obviously things have happened in a different way. There's a number of practical reasons for that. One is, you know, although the advice that we get scientifically across the UK is the same advice, you have to apply it to the circumstances that apply in different parts of the UK. So if you've got a particularly dense population, or if you've got a particularly rural population, that's going to be relevant. At the start of the pandemic, it was spreading at a different rate in different parts of the UK. So those things will suggest that you have to take a slightly different approach. More recently, you know, as we've changed these laws, you know, you've got to take the whole picture into account. So we've had a law in Wales which says employers have got to take steps in law to maintain social distancing. That hasn't been the case in England, for example. So once you start doing those things, they have, you know, you've got to take the whole picture into account. And the other thing I would say, lastly on that, you know, this isn't just an algorithm that you put the data in and it gives you the right course of action at the end of it. You've got to bring your values as well to bear as a government. And very early on, you know, when we were making some of these decisions, we took a decision that, you know, when England was opening up car showrooms and so on, and I don't criticise them for that, every government's entitled to make the judgments they think is right for their part of the UK. But at that time, we were prioritising making sure people could spend more time with other people. So we were really focusing on that kind of family and friends aspect rather than the business and commercial aspect at the start. You've got to make a choice sometimes. So it's a combination of circumstances and values.
Well, heaven knows. I mean, I've been a minister in both governments, had the privilege of it, and
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it for some of the difficult choices that need to be made, but always having the concerns of safety of the public, of staff, of employers,
Yes.
at the forefront of their mind, as well as getting the economy up in the same way. So let's go on to a question related to this, and this is from Jane, who asks, with the local lockdown that's taken place in Caerphilly this week, this was submitted about 24 hours ago. Things have moved on again. And the worry of further areas heading in the same direction. And we've seen that tonight. And England announcing a tightening up. Are we inevitably heading into an autumn and winter of increasing localized lockdowns? And is there anything we can do to stop this happening as individuals as well as at a government level?
Well, I mean, that second part of the question is the key to it, if I may say, because in a sense, it isn't inevitable, is it? You know, this is a consequence of choices that people across Wales and across the UK have been making for weeks and months, really. And it was, in a sense, inevitable that as we started to move about more than we have been doing and seeing more people, spending time with more people, then we always knew that would cause an increase in the transmission rates. But the truth of it is, the best way of making sure that we are not going to lose control is by carrying on with those really simple rules. And it's, you know, the truth is they are obviously inconvenient, aren't they? We've all been living under those constraints and they haven't gone away. You know, the virus hasn't gone away. And so all the rules about hand washing and about wearing a face covering in certain contexts and keeping your distance, all of that is essential, and it's going to be essential for some time. If we don't do that, it will dramatically increase the risk of lockdowns. On the question of local lockdowns, I do think we're going to see more of them. And, you know, a combination of the testing and tracing and protecting that's been going on in Wales and trying to manage this locally is intended to avoid us being in a situation where the whole of Wales goes back into lockdown. You know, that's obviously, you know, we're desperate to avoid that situation, obviously. So the alternative to that is being really clear about how the transmission is happening and then, you know, having to lock down perhaps on a localized basis. So I do think we will see more of it. But as I say, we can, you know, we have a chance to affect that by continuing to observe all those rules that people in Wales have been pretty good at observing for the last weeks and months. And we owe everybody really a debt of gratitude for doing that, because it's been very hard for a lot of people.
I genuinely think people have been quite amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of the speculation early on is that people wouldn't comply whatsoever. They just do their own thing. So, you know, some of the loosening that we've seen now, it amazes me that we've got this far. But I think if people do, you know, suck in once again, as they say on the rugby field, suck it in. We're going to have to do this together for all of our own good, our friends and families. Yeah. I know Scotland has been running, before the English minister mentioned it, with this, you know, quite scary slogan in a way of "Don't kill Gran," you know. But that's the hard reality of this. Every time we make a decision on thinking, shall I go down the pub? Shall I mix with that group that I shouldn't be mixing with? Shall I go out with 20 people, 30 people? Shall, you know, there are implications with every individual decision.
And, you know, to be fair, it has been hard on people. So it's, in a sense, understandable when the restrictions start to lift, that people want to go, you know, want to return to normal, really. That's a kind of understandable instinct. But we've all just got to remember that this is not normal. You know, we have not defeated the virus. And so, you know, unless we are careful, we will see it take off dramatically again, and we have to avoid that.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, in the comments there, Stephen Jones has put in something that we're quite familiar with here, this argument that isn't the answer to COVID testing, testing, and more testing. So what does Welsh Government think on that?
Well, it's the answer to COVID is targeted testing, because a test that you and I might have today only is a snapshot. It's a moment in time, isn't it, about our state of our health. It doesn't tell us about the state of our health next Friday. So the choice is how you deploy your testing capacity. And obviously in Wales, we've built that up very significantly over the last few weeks and months. You'll have seen Vaughan Gething put an extra 30 odd million into it last week to improve the turnaround times, which is really important for being able to trace people. So it is testing, but doing it in a targeted way, because that then enables you to, understand the transmission rate. And that's obviously been a big area of focus for us.
Okay, thanks. Look, we touched on the issue there that we're in this in some ways for the long haul, and we have to buckle down with it and all play our part. But it's been particularly difficult for a lot of older people, and also people who are vulnerable, either because they were originally on the extremely vulnerable list, or because they're within one of those groups that is more vulnerable, even if they're not shielding. So older underlying conditions and so on. And I've seen a lot of these firsthand, as you will have been as well, because I've had the real privilege during this of working with a couple of volunteer groups and using some of my time with people who are older, more vulnerable, doing deliveries and so on. And you can see that as every week goes on, it does grind you down, the loneliness, the isolation that you have. So let me turn to a question from Jill in Llanharan, who I know quite well over a lot of years, because Jill runs organisations with senior citizens. She's an absolute gem in what she does. And that's the concerns she is running, that the isolation and loneliness coming from protecting against the virus, staying away from friends and family and social events. Well, how can the Welsh Government and others help and support the well-being of our older citizens in their homes, but also, Jeremy, their carers too? Because some of these older people will fall into the category, Jill says, of being both an older person, a vulnerable person, and also a carer themselves.
Yeah.
If we're in this for the long haul, how can we help?
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge the problem, as you say. Clearly, people have been living through extraordinary times, and older people have had a particular burden, and it's about isolation, it's about loneliness, it's about not having access to your networks of support. So I think the first thing is, we need to be aware in all our dealings, in all aspects of public services, businesses. We've got to be aware of the level of trauma, I would say. For many people, it won't be a huge trauma, but people are very unsettled, obviously, and we've all got to be conscious of that and how we deal with people in our work. So that level is obvious. But the councils across Wales, actually, to be fair, I think have stepped up to the plate with the voluntary sectors to support people who are isolating or older residents with volunteering-based support, basically, whether it's about getting food or medicines or walking the dog, all those kind of basic things. And some councils, like my own, are continuing that service, and obviously we're encouraging that to happen. We've put money into some of the third sector organisations, the voluntary sector organisations, many of whom exist to support older citizens. So that's really important. And there's been a service like the volunteer prescription collection service. So that's still available. So if people, need that, then that is still there, basically. But we've got to recognise here, as you say, that older people have, faced a particular set of challenges in the last few months, and those challenges might come back, as we go into the autumn and winter, and as the risk of COVID increases again. So the plans we had before about priority support for supermarket slots, all of that will come back into action if we find ourselves back in that sort of situation. So all that planning has been done. It's sitting there behind the scenes, if you like. So just to reassure you, that is absolutely at the top of the list of priorities. And I was speaking to the Older People's Commissioner a few weeks ago, talking about some of these particular issues. And what we were saying together was an awful lot of older people have actually also been playing a really hands-on role as volunteers in this period, actually, and going out and supporting others. As you say, lots of people are carers. I was talking to Neath Talbot Carers Service in my own patch about some of the challenges they've had, and I think we've talked about the care system, but we haven't talked so much about people providing care, to loved ones in the home, really. And I think they need our support as well, obviously.
Okay, thanks. Look, we're going to move on to an area that Catherine has raised. She says, I live in an area that has some amazing local community groups, some of which may only still be in existence due to the benefits of EU funding. Now, I know there'll be people out there saying instantly, it's not EU funding, it's our money and so on. But the funding that's gone to them, that's come back into Wales, is what's gone into these groups. Now, she says these popular groups are quite established now, and they'd be sadly missed if they were forced to close. I worry, Catherine says, for these groups and for the void that could be left for local residents who have benefited, particularly as I live in an area of deprivation. Now, this isn't just a question to do with post-EU transition and funding. It's also to do with those COVID issues as well, because as you were saying, many of these groups are actually the knitting and the tapestry that holds these communities together, and they've been under real strain with COVID. So I guess for you and your responsibilities, it's how do we sustain these going forward and help them to do the work that they're doing, but also in that regeneration you've said, how do we make sure that they're not only there, but they can get stronger afterwards?
Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to embarrass you a bit now, Huw, by saying people watching this probably may not know that you've been leading a piece of work for the Welsh Government for the last 12 months, 18 months, looking at how we put in place new programmes after we leave the European Union to continue supporting people in the way that you've described for Catherine's group. And, we have been able to do it, as you say, as members of the EU, but we should also be able to continue doing that afterwards, shouldn't we? That's the point. Now, whether we in Wales will continue to be able to do that depends on the UK government's decisions, basically. They've promised, as you know, obviously, that the Welsh Government will continue to be able to make those decisions and will have the funding to do it. But they haven't lived up to their promises yet. And the reason it's important, again, I don't want it to sound like it's two people arguing over something that's irrelevant. The reason it's important, as we both know, is that the Welsh Government is closer to the communities that it serves. So, it's not as far from Cardiff to Ogmore as it is from London to Ogmore, simply, is it? So those community organisations have much more access to people who are putting together those programmes if they're run in Wales. We want to continue doing that. And the work that you and I have been doing together would mean that those organisations would continue to be able to get that support, provided the UK government, steps up to the plate. On the COVID side of things, I think COVID has made it, the kind of system we want, which is, the Welsh Government making decisions for communities in Wales, more important, because we know about the health inequalities in communities in Wales, and they've become worse as a consequence of COVID. And some of the programmes we want to put in place are ones which would encourage people's health and well-being at community level. So we want to be able to do that. As I say, at this point in time, we're still waiting for that decision. If it goes the way we want it to go, we will be able to carry on supporting those organisations. But at this point in time, we can't guarantee that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Listen, I'm going to throw a wide ball at you here, and it's coming from the comments there broadly on these issues. It's from Cameron, and his question is this. In the face of COVID, if schools can open, pubs can open, restaurants can open, people who work in offices can slowly go back, why aren't Welsh politicians, you and me, Jeremy, and Welsh ministers returning to their offices? Come on, Jeremy, get on with it.
Well, we're all working, so the fact that we're not in the places where we've always been working, it doesn't mean we're not working, and that's true of lots of people in all walks of life right across Wales. So a lot of people who do jobs who can work from home, they're still working, and they're still working hard. So in Wales, we are saying to people, if you can work from home, you should still work from home. That is the message we're giving to people. And so, because that is the safer option at this point in time. And because that's the case, we are demonstrating that in the way that we run our workplaces and work life. So we are saying we are finding new ways of doing our jobs by being able to work remotely, and we're encouraging other people to do the same. Now, obviously, not everybody can do that, because the only way they can do their job is face-to-face. So if you're working in a shop, if you're working in a school, that requires face-to-face contact, isn't it? So it depends on the kind of job that you do. And as you and I both know, we are back in the chamber on a kind of hybrid basis, aren't we? And I actually think it's not as good as being there in a full chamber, obviously, and it's not as good for democracy, really. But we've been pretty innovative, I would say, in the Senedd about how we've responded to this and have led the way in some ways. So that's the reason, really. We're still saying to people in Wales, if you can work from home, you should do. And by the way, your employer should support you to do that.
Okay, well, that leads really well into a question from Kerry. Kerry is one of those people who, through necessity, has been working from home during coronavirus. And she's one of many who put this question down on the challenge of the variable broadband connectivity in different streets, different communities, in different parts of Wales. So Kerry has a straight ask. What can be done to improve connectivity to help people working from home? But can I just add, Jeremy, this, as you know, also applies to pupils and students, older people who want to access services, which is increasingly online. So how can we improve that? Okay,
well, it's a really good question, and it's one that obviously a lot of people are concerned about for understandable reasons. Obviously, actually, much of this is not devolved to Wales, but the Welsh Government nevertheless has put in tens of millions of pounds to improve broadband connectivity right across Wales. And actually, in terms of the numbers of households connected, that's now extremely high. But this is a completely new level of challenge, isn't it? Because, you know, people are working at different parts of Wales at different times of the day. That's the nature of working from home. So it presents new levels of demand. So, you know, we absolutely recognise the challenge, and there are discussions going on about what we can practically do. What I would suggest, though, in truth, that again, this is one of those things which is UK-wide, isn't it? This is about the digital infrastructure of the entire country, basically, and it needs, in order to be able to respond to COVID and allow people to work from home more, it needs an upgrade, really. But one of the other things we're doing, I don't want to spend too long on this question, but just to say briefly, one of the other things we're doing is looking at people who want to not go back to the workplace, but equally can't really work in their own home because of family reasons or because of the housing they live in or whatever. So there's a means by which you can have people work remotely, but not at home, you know. So we've got lots of empty buildings in our towns at the moment, haven't we? Wouldn't it be great if we could convert those into little satellite offices? So I don't have to commute from, you know, Huw Fawr to Cardiff. I can commute from Huw Fawr to Neath Town Centre, which is, you know, a fraction of the time. And I'm there working with a group of other people, but not having to commute. So there are lots of creative things we can do. And, you know, the digital, that helps with some of the digital stuff as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, this is an opportunity if we want to rethink about what it looks like post-COVID, but it will require investment. And whilst the UK government is talking at the moment about throwing money around, not asking Wales, but throwing money around, well, if they asked us, I guess that one of the things we would say is, well, put it into that digital infrastructure. Definitely. So that, you know, and I hold my hands up. I guess some people watching this will think we've got gold-plated fibre optics coming down the line here, but we've got fibre optics in my stag where I live, and it comes up to the signal box at the end of the street, and then I've got copper cable that runs from there to my house. So, I have to laugh about this. I'm hoping I don't drop out any moment from this call. But anyway, okay, well, let's go on to this issue of building back better, and we'll come back to the town centre regeneration, because we've had lots of questions on that as well. But could you first of all, before we talk about some specifics, can you explain what your thinking is on this idea of regeneration? Because surely, if we are going to take this opportunity to do something, let's do something different and better. which actually levels the playing field up for people. Some of the things you've talked about already, the inequalities of infrastructure, the inequalities of housing, the inequalities of where jobs are, all of these things. So what's your, what sort of framework are you thinking about when you're talking about a different type of post-COVID future?
Okay, so what we're not talking about is going back to normal, because for an awful lot, well, firstly, obviously I understand that people just want things to be normal again, so I obviously understand that. But for an awful lot of people, normal wasn't great anyway, to be honest. So we're looking at trying to learn the lessons that we've learned during COVID, actually, and try and fix some of those challenges which we've been grappling with for a long time. So you asked about a framework. We're looking at it from three angles, really: economic justice, social justice, and environmental justice. So three kind of chunks of work, if you like. And what we are learning is that the burdens of COVID aren't being evenly carried by people. So if you're a young person, or if you're a woman, you're much, much more likely to be doing a job which has been in lockdown. You're much more likely to be doing a job which is not well paid. If you're a member of a BAME community, you're much more likely to have suffered the health effects of COVID. So if you're disabled as well. So there's a range of people who are carrying, more of the burden of COVID than others. And what we've got to try and do is respond to that by helping them, particularly to support them, basically. But the key thing is the question of economic justice in the next few months and years here, because, the unemployment levels are going to increase. We know that now, and we want to do everything we can as a government to support people to stay in work, or to train, or to get work in the kind of jobs that are going to become available in due course. So there's a big challenge there. Got to make sure that young people going into the jobs market get experience of work. Got to make sure that older people who lose their jobs can quickly reskill. So there's some specific things that we need to do there, really. And also try and make sure that young people who've got the option of staying on in education now do that. I mean, that's much the best thing to do at the moment, is, if you can, is to stay on, because the jobs market is going to be horrendous for a lot of people. I mean, that's not true across all sectors, by the way, but it is going to be true for a lot of people. So there's some specific things like that. Then on the environmental front, I'm sure, there's lots of things we could say in that area, but we know about the air quality that's improved by people not using their car so much. So we're trying to take advantage of this now to invest in active travel. Make sure it's easier for people to walk their kids to school rather than take the car. Those kind of practical things, and make sure that the jobs we're supporting are sustainable jobs into the future.
And listen, how do you gather the views of the public on this? What are you doing to reach out so it's not the same old faces and people giving you input?
Well, I've been really keen to avoid it being the same people that we talk to. Obviously, it's important to hear a range of voices, and we've done that, by the way, from within Wales, but also from other parts of the UK, and actually internationally as well, to learn from the way that other countries have been dealing with the response, But in Wales, we've also established just a simple email address, actually, ourfuturewales@gov.wales, ourfuturewales@gov.wales. And we've been inviting people to send us their proposals, their ideas about what they think, about their experience of COVID and what they think we should be prioritising in the response. And we've had, at the last count, I think I last looked at the end of last week, we'd had over 2,000 submissions, which, as you and I both know, for a government consultation is quite a lot. So we are working through all of those ideas now, and quite a lot of them are pointing us in the same direction, which is, it's good, because we know there's a solution to some of the challenges then. But anybody who's watching and wants us to take account of what they think we should prioritize, please send us an email, just a simple email to that email address, and we'll be taking it into account. That's
brilliant. Yeah, so I hope now you're going to be bombarded by even more, create more work for you, but more ideas. Just out of interest for you, Jeremy, Christopher has commented there that this lockdown gave us a hint of the future we should be aiming for, more emphasis on homeworking and flexibility, and that counts on employers as well, where they can, to give that flexibility. And I think a lot of employers, in some ways, have been surprised, because they've seen that home working doesn't mean lower productivity. It's actually led to more productive individuals and with more balance of work life. But of course, not everybody can do this. But Christopher says that itself can lead to fewer cars on the roads, less pollution, less congestion. So there are wins that if we think creatively here.
Definitely, and we are thinking exactly in that space.
Brilliant. Well, let's go on to another question here, which gets some really nitty-gritty things that I reckon most communities in Wales would recognise right now. Paul from Pencoed sent in a question, and it's to do with the high streets. Looking at what can be done beyond what's being done already. Jeremy, we've already had annual business rates holidays. Prior to that, even before we came into COVID, we had 2 or 3 business rate support schemes for different businesses, depending on turnover and footfall and so on. But now it's business rate holidays. We've had grants. We're in the position at the moment, I think, where it's factually accurate that the level of support for businesses generally, because of what Welsh Government has added, is way beyond what there is in any other part of the UK. But Paul's point is, when you look at high streets, you see boarded up shops, or you see banks that have left, and we don't have new tenants coming in. And this was a pre-COVID issue, but it's even exacerbated now, and it could get worse. Now, he points to really practical things like free car parking in town centres, extending the business rates holidays further, grant support and so on. Every government has been wrestling with this thing for some time. Now it's very acute. What do you think Welsh Government can do, working with local authorities, town councils and others, to try and put our high streets back in order?
Well, I mean, as you say, COVID has exacerbated an existing challenge, hasn't it, really? But the 2 sectors most adversely impacted by COVID, probably for most people, are retail and hospitality. And an awful lot of our town centres are a mix of retail and hospitality. So there's a particularly, urgent challenge there. So some things the Welsh Government can do, and some things the Welsh Government can't do. So in terms of the things that the Welsh Government can do, we have been doing the grants, we have been doing the business rates holidays and so on. And, if more resource becomes available, then that becomes a future option as well. But we've also launched the Transforming Towns Fund, which we've been putting money into towns in different parts of Wales to help build the public realm. We've got a new approach to development in town centres, which is basically COVID-proofing town centres. But the fundamental point about how we get shops back into town centres, basically, how we get hospitality back in a way which is profitable for them to run. Those are big challenges. It is not, the resource available to the Welsh Government doesn't enable us, unfortunately, to support the retail sector at large for the period that is needed for support. So that's why we've been pressing the UK government to extend the furlough, for example, in those sectors, so that we've got at least some protection for employment in those sectors. You would usually think that there'd be opportunities in the hospitality sector, but because of the COVID-proof rules, you've got cafes and bars in Neath and in your constituency and across Wales who are operating with the same costs but fewer customers, obviously. Now that's not sustainable in the long term. They are going to need some significant support. So there's some things we can do and some things that we have to ask the UK government to do. But in the slightly longer term, we need to make sure that people are coming into our town centres for those remote working hubs I was talking about, getting some of our public services back into the middle of towns, not on estates outside our towns. So there's footfall in our towns and people are then around to buy in the shops and buy their sandwich at lunchtime. So there are definitely things we can do. Some of them are slightly longer term challenges, but there's a mix of things we can do and we are doing. And there's a list of things we need the UK government to support as well. But just to be clear, we absolutely recognise that towns have had a battering as a consequence of COVID, and that we need, to carry on doing more to support them.
I mean, I got to say, I commend the businesses who've been trying to pull through this and, were moved very rapidly from being restaurants to takeaway services and adapted their businesses. I know some businesses have enhanced their online presence now as well, and there may be something Welsh Government needs to look at here. I mean, we've got a very successful business in Pontycymru locally, top of one of our valleys. You look in the window and wonder, how does he shift this stuff? Now, I won't mention what business it is, but I know him very well. He does the majority of his sales and has been doing for some time online. His shop window, literally that. It's a shop window. And he does sell to people who come up the valley specially and so on. But I think there is something here which, if we had an injection, a major injection of money, if UK government wanted to splash money around, we really could look at some real town centre regeneration on a scale we haven't seen before. And I guess if the Secretary of State for Wales was watching now or whatever, I'd say direct the money to us, because I think on the ground we know where it needs to be spent, and we could do big spatial investment. Anyway, look, a different issue here, and it does touch on this thing about getting people to work and socially around. Christopher raises the issue around transport, and particularly around bus transport. And my goodness, you know, we've seen over years the inability of local authorities across Wales and across the UK, actually, with a couple of exceptions, London, Liverpool, maybe Merseyside, to actually control their own routes, to subsidise on an area basis what they need to go. It's a bit of a free-for-all. But because of the last 10 years, where year after year we've had deep cuts into the Welsh budget, local authorities have reflected that as well, with pulling back support for services. Chris's point is a vital one, and I know this from the place that I live. We've seen shrinking of old-fashioned public bus routes, hourly, half-hourly services. Some communities have been left without. Jeremy, what hope can we give in the 6th Senedd, if there were a willing Labour government to do it, that we could do something differently on buses, not trains? Because look, I'm glad we've had the Sunday train back to my stake. It's been decades without it. It's wonderful. I'm hoping we're going to get frequency. But buses serve most of my constituency, like yours in Neath.
And mine, exactly. And, you know, I live in a part of my constituency where the bus routes really are not very good, you know, and they don't deliver what's needed, bluntly. No, buses is an area where we've been absolutely focusing because of the reasons you've just given. You know, there was an issue there anyway, obviously. You and I will have known as members of the Senedd, you know, our emails constantly about people telling us about bus routes, you know, wanting better bus routes. And we know, so that's a very, very big issue. Right across big parts of Wales. On the other hand, a vast amount of public money goes into bus services to keep them running, because, you know, whether it's concessionary fares or subsidies, as you say, a vast amount of public money goes in. So what we've been able to do as a consequence of the fact, really, that we've had to do a new relationship with the bus operators because they had nobody using the buses. So we're working with them now, actually. We've given an emergency sum of money to keep literally the show on the road, to keep the buses on the road. But we're negotiating with them now a new way, so we can make sure that in return for the money we are pumping into the sector, they deliver the routes that we want, not the routes that they want. That's at the heart of it. We haven't got the legal powers to regulate the buses in Wales at this point in time. They kept the buses regulated in London, funnily enough, but across Wales, we've had deregulated buses, we've had a market, which is why it's a disaster. But we are using the money to make sure the routes we want are the routes that they deliver. And in the next Senedd, we will be hoping to bring in, you know, other regulation. But there is stuff we can do before that using the power of public spending, really. And we are absolutely doing that at the moment. Okay, thanks. I mean, that's going to be interesting because the picture you're painting is something that could be quite different after the Senedd elections, and there would still need to be tough choices because there's never a bottomless pit. But at least those choices, Jeremy, would be made by local people and the services that they want in their areas. Precisely. Money better. And at the moment, they have no control at all over that. Yeah. Okay. Good. And having, you know, served as an MP up in Westminster, I know you could get on and off with a universal ticket on the buses and trains or whatever, and it was affordable, and they ran where you needed them to go. Yeah.
because they were run not by central government, but they were run on that localized basis. Anyway, right, we're having lots of questions we've got to pick up now before we get to the end of this hour. So please, those who are watching, please do keep your comments and questions coming in. Thomas asks, what can be done? You touched on this, Jeremy, earlier. What can be done facing current and predicted job losses and job insecurity to ensure our young people are not forgotten and we don't repeat, he says, disastrous mistakes of the 1980s? And I remember that. It was dire. Young people and others were thrown on the scrap heap. If it's going to be tough now economically, how do we avoid this?
Well, we want to make sure that people are getting the training that they need so they can stay in education or they can get the skills training that they need at FE. We want to carry on supporting our apprenticeship programme and maybe try and do that in a different way, more flexibly. We want to make sure that young people get experience of work and skills in the workplace. So you've got the UK government's Kickstarter scheme, which is basically, you know, the scheme we had, Jobs Growth Wales, isn't it? They've taken that idea. It's not quite as good as that, unfortunately. But what we are saying, you've got to, as well as, you know, provide subsidised employment, you've got to provide the skills training as well. So people have got an opportunity to develop themselves in the workplace, progress through the workplace, and then get other opportunities. You know, it's not going to be like this forever. It's a period of time. We've got to make sure we can get young people who, the reason I'm saying young people is if you are out of work young in your working life, you carry that disadvantage with you throughout the entirety of your working life. All the evidence we know says that. So the key thing is to make sure that people have an opportunity to carry on in work, you know, and getting the skills we need, working with FE to make sure those skills reflect the needs of the economy, whether it's digital skills, whether it's skills in sustainable sectors, making sure that the skills match the opportunities, but with a real focus on that age group. You know, there's a real issue of intergenerational unfairness in what's been happening in COVID, because unless we are very careful, a lot of the future burden will be carried by young people, and we've got to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, and we do have some experience of this in Wales. It's very interesting that one of the schemes that the UK government has now come up with, I saw a minister on the other day when challenged, well, this sounds remarkably like what Wales had been doing previously, and she acknowledged it and said, yeah, we've learned from the 1980s. So that's quite an interesting moment of reflection for a Conservative minister at Westminster.
It's not as good a scheme, unfortunately. It's the basic principles are the same, but the scheme we had in Wales added training into it as well, which is important. The UK government doesn't have that, but we want to try and fix that for Wales at least.
Okay, that's brilliant. Now, let me pick up one of the questions that's come in on the live comments. It's from Jen, and Jen asks, the mental health of children in the lockdown is being affected. What help is out there, and how easy is it to access it? And I know this has been a concern of yours, the mental health and well-being of young people. It can easily be ignored.
Yes.
But actually, this is equally traumatizing for some young people, and the social isolation as well as it is for anybody else.
Yeah, well, there has been funding put into schools to enhance the counselling service. So some of that is about direct counselling. Some of it is about resources for teachers and teaching staff. Some of it is about particular support for particularly vulnerable children. So there's funding that's gone in from the health service and from the education service together, really, to provide that service in schools. I know from my own constituency, and I'm sure you will from yours, Huw, that this has been a challenge for some time. And as I was saying earlier, the trauma that people have suffered, young people and children in particular, you know, the trauma may not be that long lasting and it may not be that deep, but it has to be acknowledged and it has to be supported. We don't need to medicalize this. Sometimes it's about a little bit more support to help get through the next difficult few months, really. It may be at that level, you know, we must not make it a medical issue where it isn't. But there is a task of work to be done to make sure that level of support is available for young people. By the way, for all people actually, but I think there's a particular challenge for children. And we know that's why it's so important to get kids back into school and to keep them there, because that makes a huge difference. You've got kids who haven't been to school for many, many months. and we'll both know that the effect that we've seen in our in our own areas on kids of that.
Okay, look, we're going to try and squeeze a couple of questions in, Jeremy, before we end here. We've covered a heck of a lot of ground, and just to say to people, we'll try and pick up on things we haven't by contacting people, or if you want to drop me an email, it's on the placard for the thing. I'll make sure either I answer it or I get it to your member of the Senate of your own area, and so on there. So don't worry about that. But there's a couple I want to get to, and one of these is to do with, you touched on earlier, one of the pillars of your thinking on regeneration. You mentioned the economy, you mentioned social justice aspects, and you mentioned the environment.
Yeah.
Now, I get this raised with me regularly. It really surprises me. It delights me how often this is raised with me when I go to meetings or I'm on the doorstep. I'll be with the Bridgend Youth Council shortly. I'd be really surprised if this wasn't one of the items on their agenda. So how can Wales add to what we do on the environment? You know, we got COP26 coming up next year, and you know, it's international agreements and all of that. So what can we do in little old Wales that makes a big difference?
Okay, well, there's some stuff we've done specifically as a result of COVID, right? So we've put more money into active travel for local authorities right across Wales to introduce active travel schemes in towns. You'll have seen a couple of weeks ago, almost £40 million, I think, announced to support road surfaces around schools to help people walk their kids to school and scoot to school. So we're taking initiatives like that that will help in terms of transport pollution. The last fun thing I did before lockdown was go and plant some trees in the Knoll in Neath, where we started the National Forest, for example, which is a really exciting project. And I think, you know, that really brings it alive to people, I think, the idea of a national forest. We've put money recently into expanding growing trees right across Wales. We want to do that for environmental reasons, but we also see it as an economic opportunity. We can build houses with timber frames in Wales. So timber as a crop as well, really important. There's a real push now on green housing and energy efficiency retrofitting. We've put quite a lot of money into that in the last few weeks, and there's potential to expand that. And that's great because that's green jobs. It helps with fuel poverty. It's obviously better in terms of reducing energy consumption. That meets a lot of objectives for us as a government. But the key thing as well is, you know, we've got to make sure there's a green recovery for the economy coming out of COVID. And it isn't a question of stimulating the economy and forgetting about the environmental objectives. We do the two things together. We know that the green sectors in the economy are faster growing than many other sectors. So there's an economic opportunity coming out of the environment for us here as well. You know, I live in a part of the world that gets flooded relatively frequently, and we've had some floods recently in Neath Town, for example. So there's more that can be done around flood infrastructure, you know, so to make sure that we've got, you know, trees being planted in a way which naturally harness water higher up the water flow. So there's lots of very positive things that we are doing and we'll be continuing to do. You know, the environment is one of the top priorities for us as a government, not just in coming out of COVID, but overall. We announced a climate emergency last year and two really stretching targets about public sector carbon neutral by 2030 and then the 2050 targets as well. So I think we've responded to that really well, but we mustn't and we won't lose our focus on that because there are other pressures.
Okay, thanks. Listen, I'm going to paraphrase a question that's come in from somebody I know very closely and very personally, Rodri, who is absolutely fanatical on the necessity to make a step change in the way we approach things like the climate change emergency, the mass extinctions that have been in the news in the last few days at a Wales level and a national level. Do you think, Jeremy, that we get that in Welsh government, that it's not incremental changes we're looking at, it is step change, dramatic ways in which we view how we run our economy, our society, and so on?
I do think that, Huw, and I think that you can see that in various aspects of our policy, whether it's plastics at one end to biodiversity initiatives at the other end. But here's the thing, I think during COVID, people have got a better appreciation of what a real crisis looks like, what a crisis looks like when you haven't been able to prepare for it properly, what individual action can do, what governments can do, and what science and experts can tell us. And all those things are things we can build on to make sure everybody understands the scale of the climate emergency that we face. Because government action is vital, it's essential, but it can't be the only thing. There has to be a very widespread understanding of the scale of the crisis. And I think we are more likely to be able to explain and persuade people of that, the other side of COVID, than we were before, because of what people have been living through.
Okay, thanks. And I'd better explain the significance of that. I think that that Rodri is a close family member, so I will check afterwards and see if they're satisfied with your answer as well. I'll let you know.
Listen, feedback.
We've actually just run just over the hour, but I got one question that I really have to ask, because it's coming from a lot of people in my constituency. Your constituency and mine, Jeremy, are characterised by choirs in every town and village.
Yeah.
I think I've got 7 choirs in my stag alone, in the Ogmore Valley, in Pencord, in the Garw, everywhere, absolutely everywhere, let alone the Bridgend or the Kenfig Hills. You will be the same.
Yeah.
Many of them have older members who've been locking themselves away in some way, keeping away, but they are desperate to get back, singing together. Enid Sean has been in touch with me. She runs the Maesteg Children's Choir, has done with her mother for 3 decades and more. She also sings along with her daughter, Rian, in local choirs herself. I guess the news that we're seeing at the moment on the news channels in England, Scotland, here in Wales, make me a little bit pessimistic, but you know I keep raising this with ministers as well.
You do.
Can we give any hope that choirs can get back to anything that looks like normality in practicing, because it matters so much to hundreds of people within our constituencies?
Well, it's a big issue in my part of the world, Huw, as you say, as well, for choirs, but also in my part of the world for brass bands as well. There's a number of brass bands who are in a similar situation, who want to be rehearsing and can't. So the simple answer, I'm sure it's not one that you want to hear or that your constituent wants to hear. Outside, it is possible to rehearse now. Now, I know it's getting towards October now, so I do understand that that's a limited thing, but it is possible to perform and rehearse outside, provided you've got a maximum of 30 people and you're socially distanced. So I know it's not ideal, I'm not pretending it is, but that is now at least possible. In terms of doing it indoors, I'm afraid I cannot give a date, if you like, of when that's likely to happen. What we are told by the scientists is that singing and wind instruments, blowing as it were, are at the pretty risky end of things, really. We are talking, I will say that we are talking to arts organisations, Wales-wide arts organisations, about whether we can bring forward guidance which might allow it to happen. And we have been trying to think about ways in which we can open up some of those communal activities indoors in community halls and so on. But I wouldn't want to say to you, don't worry, it's a few weeks away. We're not in that position, because it's unfortunately at the higher end of the things that are risky. I know that's not what, I wish I wasn't saying that to you, but I'm afraid that is the position at the moment.
Listen, there's a necessity in all of these things now for just straightforward honesty on this.
Yeah.
I'm not, as we may have seen elsewhere, over optimism and just bigging up, we're going to be out of this tomorrow. It isn't going to happen. But, just a little bit of credit to some of my choirs there who have been patient, but also ones like Ogmore Choir and Boys Coedra who are very involved with the national choir organisations. And I know some of yours and they have been working with the Arts Council of Wales, getting the guidance in place ready for that time when it can be done safely. We just need to make sure it'll be done safely. But look, I'll keep on badgering you and others so that when we're ready, we can get back to it. But listen, Jeremy, we're over time. It's flown past. thank you so much, because, I mean, you laid out your responsibilities earlier tonight. They are immense, and the fact you can spare an hour and a bit to spend time with us and to take all these questions. We've covered COVID, we've covered the Constitution, we've covered choirs and everything in between.
Yeah.
For people who have been listening in, if you've enjoyed this, then let me know. We will try and do more. Jeremy might not want to come back, but I will get some other messages.
We've covered a lot of ground, thank you.
and also to say, if you've got any other thoughts that you want to email to me or to Jeremy, do that. If there are things, and you're not from my area, but you want me to pass on to your own member of the Senedd, by all means get in touch and we will facilitate that. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope it's been interesting for you. Some bits will have been more interesting than others. Others you'd have gone and made a cup of tea on. But part of what we're trying to do is, while we're in this situation, is try to be as accessible as possible. Ministers, backbenchers like myself and others. And also, I have to say, listening to the questions that you do, because both for Jeremy and me, and I can see Jeremy nodding now, the way we do policy in Wales is by listening to people, adjusting, learning, sometimes arguing, sometimes disagreeing, but we are close to the people we represent, and that's how we do it. That's what, actually, to come back to the earlier point, Jeremy, that's what devolution is all about. It's not about arcane structures, it's about getting the power down as close as you can to the people who make the decisions.
Yeah.
So, listen, thank you, Jeremy, very much. Did you want to say anything in closing?
Just to say thank you to you for organising it. I've really enjoyed it. We've covered an awful lot of ground, a lot of issues, and I'm really grateful to people who've taken the time for sending in questions. Just one final thing, if I may. If anybody has got ideas they want us to take into account, as I say, in terms of the post-COVID planning, the email to send them to is ourfuturewales@gov.wales. So please do send in your thoughts.